All right. Well, we're going to move along with nitrogen and talk about nitrogen sources or nitrogen additions. And this is really going to encompass the things that we just talked about, this kind of first piece of the nitrogen cycle. So, again, additions or sources are nitrogen fixation, fertilizer, deposition from rainfall, um, lightning, and then plant animal residues. So we can kind of classify or categorize those into maybe a few different types of additions of nitrogen into the system. So globally, thinking about nitrogen, plant available enters and leaves ecosystems through various pathways. So we just talked about that through as we talked through the nitrogen cycle. Okay, and global nitrogen sources have been changing over time. Not surprisingly, the last 100 years has seen a dramatic change of introduced what we would call biologically reactive nitrogen into the earth, right? Um, we've got some of that has been kind of agriculturally driven, and most of it's been agriculturally driven. Some of that has been because of the types of plants that are being grown and selected for and kind of raised, harvested, i.e., legumes. A lot of clovers and alfalfas and things that fix nitrogen, we know. Um, but then, of course, a major part of that is also nitrogen fertilizer. And so I'll just direct your attention to this box down here, this figure, 1800, 1900. So there's a big leap from, in just 100 years. And the nitrogen primarily coming from animal manures, crop residues, etc. Uh, as we kind of move up the chain, we can see really starting in 1950, it's this bottom box that really appears, and that's the synthetic nitrogen. That is essentially manufactured nitrogen fertilizer. And that box grows, the other boxes of animal manures, crop residues, nitrogen fixation um, really stay pretty much the same. I mean, a little fluctuations over the last 50, 60 years, but the box that's really grown the most, of course, is this bottom box, which is commercial nitrogen fertilizer. Okay, so that really shouldn't kind of come as a surprise for many people that we understand that the role that nitrogen fertilizer plays and the important, really critically important role that it plays in kind of maintaining ag productivity. This is a process called the Haber-Bosch process, and we'll talk about this here in a second. But um, we can think of most of the additions or the new nitrogen sources are coming from the atmosphere. So manufactured fertilizers ultimately come from the nitrogen in the atmosphere. Nitrogen fixing bacteria, whether those be symbiotic through legumes or non-symbiotic, is atmosphere derived N2 gas. Deposition, lightning the same way. And then we've got these kind of organic inputs. And we could, depending on how we're looking at this, we can think of these as new inputs, crop residue or animal manure, but they might really just be recycled from the current system already. So, animal manure can certainly be brought in from the outside. Crop residue is the same. But depending on where we're drawing that box in the system and how large that box is, it could be kind of a transformation, an internal modification or transformation, or it could, theoretically or conceptually be a new input. And so this is data from the United States, estimated percent of total N added to U.S. cropland by various sources. Okay, so you can see in the U.S. These are in million tons and percentages. Commercial nitrogen fertilizer, about 60% of the total N added. Legumes, crop residues, about a quarter, 24%. Animal manures, 15%, and then other sources 4%. So really, it's, vast majority is commercial nitrogen and then legumes and crop residues. But fertilizer, commercial N at 60% and likely growing, continues to be a major source of new N. This is especially true in the United States. This would be true in a lot of developed economies as well. In the developing nations, access to markets is really going to drive that, and it might be a very different story depending on where you're at in the world. But this is specifically for the United States. So let's talk about the Haber-Bosch process. Okay, so there's a lot of interesting um, history that goes along with this. You know, this is a you ask the average person on the street about the Haber-Bosch process, and most people are going to look at you with a blank stare. They just This is stuff that's just not taught in school. But the reality is that really the scaffolding of civilization, our entire global society rests on this process. It's enabled people to really specialize and pursue scholarly things. This whole idea of freeing people up from the tyranny of agriculture and being able to specialize and do all the things that we've done as kind of a global society over the last 100 years. It's quite phenomenal to really reflect on that. But make no mistake that it's been largely attributed, for better or for worse, to this process. Okay, and I've got a nice YouTube video here. It's a little bit cheesy, but I highly recommend. I'll post this. I think it's worth watching just to provide some historical context. And there's a lot of interesting stuff that has been written. If this does interest you, I'd recommend that you explore kind of further. But essentially, in the early 1900s, there was a scientist, Haber, that really was trying to figure out how to take nitrogen and hydrogen and make ammonium. Okay, and so there's this. Well, I will spare you all the details. I'm not, that familiar with all of them. I'm not a scholar on this by any stretch, but really, it was about kind of trying to figure out how to circumvent this equilibrium of nitrogen and hydrogen. And he figured out that if we put this under pressure and continuously add hydrogen and nitrogen, we can get production of ammonium. Okay, so the process is we take CH4. This is methane. Okay, so this is essentially natural gas. We add nickel as a catalyst. I'm not sure if that was done back then, but we essentially take methane, and we take hydrogen and atmosphere. Uh, okay, so sorry about that. Let me back up. I'm getting ahead of myself. So we take methane and water, and we're basically, the first step is going to be production of hydrogen. Okay, so this is facilitated over a number of different steps, and you can see this 350 degrees, a lot of energy, a lot of temperature to essentially break the hydrogen from this methane. And then once we have hydrogen, we're taking hydrogen, H2 gas, and nitrogen from the air, and we're combining hydrogen, 3 hydrogen H2s plus nitrogen, dinitrogen gas, again under pressure and temperature, and we get this NH3, so 2 NH3s, and then that is a gas form. If it's cooled, it can be liquid form. Okay, so sorry, that was sloppy, but hydrogen and nitrogen combined through pressure and temperature to essentially produce NH3. This is ammonia, and this is really the building block of all nitrogen fertilizer. Okay, so Franz Haber did this in 1909 on kind of the bench, and then 4 years later, working at BASF, Carl Bosch took this and kind of engineered. These guys understood the significance of what this actually meant, right? And what Bosch did was be able to take this and work out some of the kinks and be able to produce this on an industrial scale. Okay, so this is really a huge piece of kind of you can't really tell a story of human history without including this facet, because it's really it's allowed for our agricultural systems to become much, much more productive, and population has kind of scaled with the productivity of those systems. Okay, um, it's estimated that 90 or 80% of nitrogen in human tissue is derived from the Haber-Bosch process. That's quite a striking number, right? You think about 4 out of every 5 nitrogen molecules in your body is come from essentially the synthetic production of nitrogen fertilizer. And that's because, of course, as humans, we are highly reliant on agriculture, and the vast majority of humans are highly plugged into that agricultural system that relies on nitrogen fertilizer, right? Okay. Watch the YouTube clip. I'll post this in the page, and I think you'll find it interesting, hopefully. Okay, cost of nitrogen fertilizer has historically tracked the cost of of natural gas, and that's simply because nitrogen fertilizer is natural gas plus nitrogen, right? It's the CH4 plus that nitrogen in the atmosphere. Okay, the last 10 years, you can see that it's tracked historically fairly well. When there's spikes, they're often spikes in natural gas are often spikes in nitrogen fertilizer. But there's a lot of demand for N, and low natural gas price, particularly in the U.S. Natural gas prices have just been at very, very low prices for the better part of a decade, or even longer than that, particularly. So that same trend, isn't true maybe the last 10 years, but historically has been true. Okay, so N fixation, BNF, or biological nitrogen fixation, is facilitated through diazotrophic microorganisms, bacteria. Okay, so it can be symbiotic and it can be non-symbiotic. We talked about this, touched on this a little bit earlier, but let's kind of get into this a little bit. So legumes have a symbiosis with Rhizobia species. There's a lot of different species of Rhizobia that are out there. Legumes examples include clovers, soybeans, peanuts, alfalfa. These are in the Fabaceae family, okay? So, and represents the vast majority of associations that are known. There's also, that are symbiotic, that is. There are also other symbiotic associations, namely actinorhizal, and examples are like alder and bayberry. These are not that Rhizobia species, but they're a kind of Frankia species, and likely others involved in that as well. And so then there are these kind of non-symbiotic or associative, and those are generically can be classified as kind of free living in bulk soil, so not associated with plant roots. They just kind of live in the soil or hang out in the soil wherever they might be. Or they can be found kind of right in the rhizosphere, right at those kind of root soil interface, or in maybe intracellular spaces in the plant roots. And so there's examples of this that have been found and documented in the past. Nitrogen fixation by legumes is really an incredible kind of process that, if you are interested in kind of these symbiotic relationships, this is a great story to kind of dig into. A tremendous amount of complexity that's involved in this. This is a relationship that's evolved over I don't know how long, but it's an old relationship. It's been around for a long, long time. Signaling that happens that with chemical signaling with plant roots of the legume, and then with going back and forth with the Rhizobia. Essentially what happens is as that plant grows, it's sending out signals. The Rhizobia send back. The Rhizobia attached to, say, these root hairs. More chemical signaling happens. The root hair starts to curl. It entraps Rhizobia, or a colony of Rhizobia, and then forms what classically we all understand are nodules. Okay, and so there's a lot that goes on within a given nodule, but the whole idea, and you've likely encountered this before, but the plant is fixing photosynthate, it's fixing carbon, it's providing energy to that rhizobia, and that rhizobia in turn is taking that plant energy, it's fixing nitrogen, and provides that plant with nitrogen. Okay, so it's this quote unquote symbiotic relationship. Now there's all this pretty awesome stuff that happens. Nitrogen fixation is essentially ruined within the presence of oxygen. So it's got to, a lot of that ammonia and oxygen is shuttled through this like leg hemoglobin. It's called leg hemoglobin, and that's why a lot of these actively fixing nodules might be pink inside. That's that leg hemoglobin. So it's like hemoglobin like we have in our bodies, in our blood, but it's actually a legume produced hemoglobin, so it's a little bit different compound. Rhizobia and legumes they're like, legumes need typically rhizobia to exist, and if you've got a failure of a legume stand, often it might get chalked up to the seed not being inoculated or the soil not being inoculated with the right rhizobia strains. Soil acidity can severely restrict the survival of rhizobia, so again, this idea of pH being a very important indicator, a very important component of having healthy and actively nitrogen fixing rhizobia in legume nodules. And bacteria can fix a lot of the plant need for nitrogen. So 25 to 90% of the total need. It can amount to 100, 200 pounds of N per acre per year. It's not at all a trivial amount in terms of total amount of nitrogen fixed. Okay, and it's interesting too because there's been studies where legumes are been grown in nitrogen poor environments, and then they're fertilized. And the legume will actually start to shunt off the energy that's going into those nodules. So there's certainly feedbacks that happen depending on the plant demand for nitrogen at any given time. All right, 50% of annual global biological nitrogen fixation is through this legume-rhizobia relationship. Okay, here's some pictures of nodules on legume roots. If you've never seen them before, this is would be considered a loaded, lot of nodules on these roots. And here's the rub. Bacteria, we talked about this in the Haber-Bosch process, but it's not particularly that different. That happens mechanically or biochemically in the actual rhizobia itself. And so it takes nitrogen from the atmosphere, and look at this, 16 ATPs, okay? So it's a tremendous amount of energy that's required to take nitrogen and energy with hydrogen, and it forms this NH4, okay? And so that will get converted to NH3, and then it gets transported, depending on, it might even go into other like ureide compounds, things like this. Depending on the plant, will essentially convert it to carrier forms, and that gets translocated to the plant for use. Okay, so legumes prefer soil nitrogen, nitrate and ammonium, because it requires less energy to fix N2. So if given a choice, and there's been studies that have kind of documented this, plants will essentially take up soil nitrogen because it's free, right? Why pay for something? Why pay a rhizobia to fix you nitrogen if you can get nitrogen for free in the soil? So that's certainly the preference for plants to take it up themselves than to fix photosynthesis and photosynthate and shuttle that to a nodule to feed a rhizobia. So, or a colony of rhizobia. So that's just something to keep in mind. Non-symbiotic fixation. This has been documented for some important C4 grasses. Important meaning economically important. Things like sugarcane. It's probably the best studied system of a C4, a warm season grass that relies heavily on this non-symbiotic N fixation. And so Been a lot of work on this. More recently, in miscanthus is a bioenergy crop. The reality is that if you dig into the weeds here, nitrogen fixation methodology is really challenging. It's really tricky, and being able to accurately quantify this is very difficult, as a matter of fact. And so it's difficult to quantify. So determining total contribution on kind of like a mass balance basis is often difficult. But we know that there are definitely examples of non-symbiotic N2 fixation that happen. And when we find a few examples, it's probably not a stretch to think that they exist in a lot more places than what we've found. So, microbiology and kind of the study with a lot of the new molecular methods, nucleic acid-based methods, we've really come to understand last 20 years how much there is in the soil, the extent of enzymatic and genetic diversity of microorganisms far exceeds any multicellular organism diversity that exists. We think of all the different plants and animals that are out there, and it's a tiny slice of what microbes are capable of, and kind of their evolution in general. And so, here's a table of a few. We don't need to commit these to memory, but you might have heard of some of these: Azobacter, Azospirillum, Rhizobia, actinomycetes. These are things that are N2 fixing organisms. But we know that there's a lot that are out there, and probably a lot that we even haven't characterized yet, that do important roles and important functions. So again, you can kind of dig into and there's people that specialize in this, colleagues of mine actually from a former life, but looking at all the diazotrophic diversity, all the organisms that have the capacity to fix nitrogen, and there's a huge kind of diversity out there, and they encompass a large part of the microbiology in the soil. Okay, contributions of nitrogen from legumes. Depending on the legume, there might be more or less fixed, and that shouldn't be surprising. Some legumes are very aggressive and grow a lot of biomass, and some are kind of not the opposite of that. Something like alfalfa at the top of this table, we can see that it can fix a tremendous amount of nitrogen, up to 300 pounds per acre per year. More typical might be something about 200 pounds. That's a lot of nitrogen to fix, for a legume. And this is just a chart to kind of give you some idea of where we're at, or what some of the crops that you might be familiar with can do or are capable of in terms of fixing through biological nitrogen fixation. Okay, so atmospheric deposition and lightning. This is another source, and depending on where you are in the world, it can be an important source. Okay, so again, combustion of fossil fuels is the primary generator of nitric oxide, nitric acids, and those can really increase deposition rates. So atmospheric compounds are deposited from rain and snow, precip in general. They can contain ammonium, nitrate, nitrite, and inorganic N, right? So there's stuff, not a whole lot, but there's stuff in the atmosphere that gets swept up or burnt, through burning or through various ways. And then these nitrous oxide, N2O, NO, sometimes it's just abbreviated as like NXO, is emitted to the atmosphere, and again, primarily from fossil fuel combustion, things like coal, things like gasoline, et cetera, and this is an important greenhouse gas, and we'll talk more about this. But in areas that have a lot of fossil fuel combustion, things like coal-fired power plants along the Ohio River, or large population areas where there's a lot of number of cities, which is kind of true in the Midwest, and if they're burning or factories or whatever it might be, um, the jet stream's moving kind of across the United States from west to east, and then some of this gets concentrated, and nitrogen deposition, particularly in Ohio, but in the eastern Corn Belt and into the Northeast, is high, right? And so it says this is nitrate ion wet deposition. So what comes, nitrate that falls in actual rain. And you can see at this high level, the bright red on this graph, I'm not sure we actually hit the bright red, but somewhere between 15 to 20 kilograms per hectare, that is roughly equivalent to a pound per acre. So 15 to 20 pounds per acre in 2011 at least has been deposited through wet deposition. So, that's not a trivial amount. That can be, half or a quarter or a tenth of the nitrogen requirement of a given crop, depending on how nitrogen hungry it is. So suffice it to say that, atmospheric deposition, and again, like lightning can strike, and then these nitrate or these nitrogen compounds are formed, and then through precipitation, we get this. And each one of these, we'll talk more about this, but we've got a great this NADP, National Atmospheric, you can maybe read it down here, National Atmospheric Deposition Program is a federal program that monitors precipitation and the actual concentration of these in the atmosphere and sees how that changes over time. So it's a long-term monitoring program. It's a really tremendous source of information that we have. So, okay, organic inputs, just generically, animal manures, crop residues, compost amendments, etc., etc. These can be thought of as new additions or simply transformations, depending again on how far, where we draw the boxes, where it comes from. But these, of course, are all pieces that contain not just nitrogen, but a lot of other things, right? It's the building blocks. Animal manures and crop residue are the building blocks of organic matter. And that's, those are organic compounds that contain nitrogen. So to wrap up, nitrogen sources or additions include atmospheric and organic, but primarily a lot of what we think about in terms of the source of N going into the soil is from the atmosphere, and that's through fertilizers and fixation. So that nitrogen gas that is fixed either chemically through Haber-Bosch or biologically. Atmospheric deposition through lightning strikes or through burning of fossil fuels, and that lightning piece. And then of course there's this whole organic component of crop residue, animal manures, that can be new sources into the system.